Hey everyone, I am beyond excited to be welcoming Charles Pierce back to the Weaviate podcast. Charles was our second Weaviate podcast guest, and now he's back for the 69th episode of the Weaviate podcast. So a ton has changed in the space of large language models and vector databases, as well as what Charles has been working on. So when we first talked, Charles was working on Kenius, and now Charles is building this incredible tool, Tactic Generate. So I wanted to quickly give a tour of what this is. I think this will also really help ground the conversation topics in the podcast to get a little sense of what this looks like. So to get started, I've loaded in 3 papers that I'm currently looking at. Ranker, perspectives on large language models for relevance judgments. LLMs can accurately predict searcher preferences. And so all I did is I just, grabbed the archive URL from these papers, click sources, add, import URL, and then drop the paper in. So what you can do is you can ask questions across multiple documents. So if I ask the question, what are some of the challenges of using large language models to annotate search relevance? I can get an answer based on each of these different papers. So each of these different papers might have found a different kind of conclusion about these questions. If you have a question like, say you loaded in different retrieval augmented training papers and you say, how effective is this versus just fine tuning without retrieval? And then you have this question answered across multiple documents. I think it's such an interesting tool. The user interface makes it so easy to kind of ask these really complex questions, as well as to export your summaries and share it across your team. So I think this is going to have a huge impact on research and how we use these kind of retrieval augmented generation tools. So hopefully that gave you a sense of what Tactic Generate is about. With that said, I love this podcast. It's such a fun conversation. Let's dive into it. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching the Weaviate podcast. I'm super excited to welcome Charles Pierce back to the Weaviate podcast. Charles Pierce was our second Weaviate podcast episode, and now we're back with the 69th episode of the Weaviate podcast, nearly a year and a half later. Charles, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Connor. It is great to be back. Very happy to be back on the podcast and to catch up on what's changed. It's only been a year, just a bit over a year and a half, but I think in the land of ML and AI, that's probably like 10 years. So I think there's a lot to catch up on.
Yeah, the scope of everything. I rewatched our episode preparing for this, and we were talking about graph embeddings, rotating, and that was kind of the most exciting thing at the time. And now we have these LLMs, and yeah, everything is totally different. So maybe to kick things off, last time we were framing our podcast around Kenius, and now you're building Tactic and Generate. Can you tell me about what you're working on?
Yeah. So I'm working at Tactic, working on on all things machine learning there. And Tactic has we kind of have 2 core kind of products that we're working on. And the first are our core product at Tactic, which we've been building for the last 2 years or so, is really focused on kind of sales and marketing teams. And it's really to help them do kind of enrich their accounts in their CRMs and to do research on all of those accounts and at really, really high scale. So, in the tens of thousands. And to discover net new accounts and that kind of stuff. But it's very much focused for like kind of sales, marketing, RevOps people. And whereas lately, the last couple of months, we've been building this new product, and it's called Tactic Generate. And Tactic Generate is really aimed towards a problem that we've definitely heard a lot from our existing customers, which was, you guys are really good right now at going out into the internet and like retrieving relevant snippets and insights for us to help us enrich our accounts. But we also have all of these documents internally, and we have all these really, really big PDFs or, Excel sheets or PowerPoints, whatever. And they wanted to do analysis on those or do some really kind of in-depth research on those. And we heard that problem a lot, and we decided to build a product for that. And that's what Tactic Generate is. It's built for kind of researchers, analysts, journalists, and in general, it's really for knowledge workers, people that are doing kind of fairly in-depth knowledge work. And what it isn't is it's not a chat tool. It's not, we're not trying to do a chat GPT or anything like that. There's some really great products out there that do that. And that's not kind of the wheelhouse that we want to operate in for this, where it's a slightly different target.
It's super interesting. Yeah, I'd love to stay because, firstly, I really like the interface of, you have the kind of like left panel of upload the documents and you put up, let's say 5 documents, and then you have the middle interface for the, the questions that you've answered. And yeah, I love this. Kind of maybe diving in a bit quickly, but this like Llama Index, one of the most interesting kind of like LLM framework things has been this kind of like comparison across documents prompt, where you kind of like one of the examples was let's say the five PDFs are like laws, and I think in the tactic generate video it's like where was this established, and it's like this one 1930, this one 1940, this one 1960. So that kind of like question answering across the documents. Can you tell me more about how you think about that? Just like, yeah, like question answering across multiple documents. Yeah, like comparing multiple documents with LLMs.
Yeah. I think this is really why we decided to build this, is because I think a lot of people out there, when they can upload a document or two maybe to some of the existing chat applications out there, but when you get in the scale of tens to hundreds of documents, it gets kind of hard, and a lot of the services out there actually block you from doing this anyway, because understandably that's a lot of context, and if they're not using let's say vector search in the back end, they're trying to fit this in context and it becomes impossible. So the way we wanted to think about this was, if you want to do cross document comparison, that should be super easy to do. And we know that there's a lot of researchers out there that have kind of documents that might be similar. The example we often think of is annual reports. So
Mm.
a public company that's doing annual reports every year, you might be working for a financial institution and have 100 annual reports that you have to ask the same set of questions about, extract the same set of information across, and you need to get all that data and you need to do it fast. Well, in the manual research world, this could probably be, at best 2 days work, at worst a week or two's worth. Um, but it's actually a relatively easy task. But the format that you extract that data in is actually quite important. People like to have this in a tabular kind of format, or in an easy way to do comparisons. So this was the initial kind of starting ground for Tactic Generate. When we thought about it, we were like, we want to enable this one task first to begin with. So we built it so that you could upload 100 annual reports and then ask a set of questions of those annual reports, and then bring all of that data back, and then have a nice table displaying all
Mm.
the data. But then furthering from that, we also want to go forward with the next step of what analysts and researchers do, which is probe that data. And we're really trying to mimic and learn from the workflows of researchers and the users we're trying to build this for. So we kind of kept asking ourselves, okay, we've extracted this data, and then what? What do we do next with it? So that's what we're really focusing on as well, which is actually, once we get this data extracted, having some actions that we can take. So if you give me a table of answers about 100 annual reports, I should be able to re-prompt this, or like re-question, ask a question now over all of this extracted data,
Mm.
that is a more complex piece of analysis. Like, given this data above, which of these companies is best positioned in to utilize AI in a positive way, or given the above results, which of these companies is sensitive to interest rate changes? These types of like
Mm.
more complex questions. So
Mm.
that's kind of like what our thinking around it was.
Yeah, wow, that's so interesting. I mean, the yeah, just the idea of turning, you have questions as the columns in like a CSV, and the value is the answer to the question for each of the documents, and then applying some kind of processing on top of that. Yeah, that's also amazing. I think kind of like, in our theme of catching up after a year and a half, this kind of like LLM calls, kind of like this is like chaining, this is like the core idea of laying chain, where like it does these intermediate inferences, and then from there you can do something else with the output of that LLM call. It kind of sounds like that to me.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big way, kind of, in which we think of it. And another really tricky part of this, that we still kind of very much consider ourselves in the beta phase. We're getting a lot of feedback because we had a great response to it when we released. But what we really are trying to do as well is try to automate as much of this process in the background as well. So, whether it's query routing or deciding when to chain or when not to chain, based on the data we have, or as Llama indexes, we've learned from when to create
Mm.
queries and combine those back. All of these kind of complex things are really important when building an application like this. And yeah, it's quite exciting, and it's pretty much changing every week. But yeah.
Yeah, this is music to my ears. I think this is so interesting. It kind of relates to like we have this kind of Weaviate land idea called generative feedback loops, where you take the data, transform it with an LLM, and then save it for further processing. And I guess like my question, so yeah, this whole like sub question query engine, as Llama Index calls it, or this kind of question decomposition, transform the data to use it in some way later, is also interesting. I mean, I've been really trying to reason through this because I know that some people think that kind of like auto GPT style, where you just kind of let the LLM recursively decide to split the task into more tasks, and it goes on, and people say, okay, that makes for a great demo, but it's quite hard to really tame that thing for something practical. I think what you found where you break it into kind of these tasks of first asking a question over all the documents and then trying to reason about how you combine those answers from each of the documents. It's yeah, it sounds really, I love this kind of thinking. And yeah, I'm just curious, like, so I guess my question, so you found this kind of chain of like, in Weaviate also we have like a generate API where we would call this like single result prompting, where you apply it to each of the search results and then you have a group result. So it's like you found this chain that's really useful. So yeah, that I think my question is like, what is your sentiment on these chains, the discovery of these kind of chains, and yeah, I guess how you think about applying new chains, and this one particularly where you transform documents into question answering pairs. Now you have a structured view, and now you have some comparison prompt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually how we think about chains has been something that's really been on my mind, because um, I kind of agree with what you said about these. When you hear about things like Auto GPT, a lot of the time is they really are great for demos. But for anyone that's tried to ship them in production, everyone knows it's a very different situation. And as well as that, it can also become prohibitively expensive if you're depending on third party LLMs. And I think this is why I've seen topics on Twitter where people say, "Will vector, are vector search needed in this like constantly evolving world?
Mm.
Can we effectively just put everything into one big giant context?" And I'm in the vector search school, and I have a good reason for it, and it's because LLMs can be used kind of like a hammer for everything,
Mm.
but it can be a very expensive hammer if you use it for everything when it doesn't need to be. And if OpenAI release a new model tomorrow which has 100k context length, well then someone's just going to start wanting to put in 100 documents that have a million context length, and then if they increase it, it's going to be this cat and mouse game. So I think you know it's always important to actually keep efficiency in mind when we're designing these things. So when we think about chains, it's like they're useful, and doing the kind of chaining sub actions is a useful task to do. But preferably, we would like to control as much of that ourselves. And a lot of the time, it usually ends up with us building some micro chains, and it's not maybe not using
Mm.
a framework that will do it for us, and just kind of doing it ourselves out of the box. A lot of the time, because it just gives you that bit of finesse and control that when you have kind of a vertically integrated app, you need some sort of like business kind of knowledge applied to that. So we find that helps. And yeah, we've just found that if we can smartly combine vector search, and not just vector search, but also the embeddings you get back. It's really important to remember the embeddings that we store in Weaviate are very rich in themselves. And if for people out there, what were once considered like big normal machine learning tasks like clustering, they might be, I feel like they're becoming more archaic now, but they're obviously not. But if you know how to do a few tricks with embeddings and understanding what those latent spaces and semantic representations mean, you can do a lot of these tasks that are expensive LLM calls just using those. The embeddings are very powerful objects, and they're much cheaper to play with than LLM calls a lot of the time. So we've had really good luck with
Mm,
that, and we like to use it that way. So I think, to summarize, what I'm trying to say is chaining queries together is great, but having a bit of control over them, like manual control, is important in production situations, and also exploring what avenues are cheaper avenues are there in terms of inference and
mm.
overall cost is really important, and for the equivalent results, I think a lot of the time.
Yeah, I really want to come back to, well, there are two things I want to come back to with the, yeah, like how you discover these micro chains you mentioned, and I have something interesting for that as well as then the cheaper inference thing too. But yeah, maybe like quickly touching on these points, I think the clustering, the topic modeling thing, it's still so fascinating to me. I love that kind of topic. I see startups, I see, Martin Grutendorf, who we still had on who we had on the podcast. He's still hitting it with the topic modeling, adding the Llama 2 to it, and he's doing awesome stuff. Then we have like Nomic AI and Arise AI that are, and I think Weights and Biases has like a visualize your latent space part of their product too. But yeah, there's because I imagine this, coming back to tactic generate, like I give you 100 annual reports, or I give you 100 Slack message or like a customer support thing is something I think about a lot, and then you cluster it, and then you tell me the topics. I think there's still so much use in that, and then one other kind of little thing I wanted to touch on, maybe we'll come back to it later, was yeah, like this vector search thing. I'm actually, my perspective on Weaviate these days is I'm kind of thinking of, my scope of Weaviate is expanding for how I personally see it. Like Weaviate has an aggregate API as well. So with this generative feedback loop thing, what you could do is you let's say the one of the questions you're asking each of your documents is what was the annual revenue for this year, and then you store that as an int property in Weaviate, like feed it back to Weaviate, and then you can have, what's the average revenue, so you can do just those symbolic aggregations. And so I think especially as retrieval augmented generation is evolving, like Weaviate, I think it's cool for people to know that you can use it just for like JSON retrieval. Like you can just apply filters and just get your data out of it. You can also do SQL style, and then you can also do vector search. And I think the scope of that is going to continue to evolve as well. I think I could write like a whole blog post on diving into that topic, but
Yeah.
yeah, so I really want to come back to, so these micro chains, and I've heard this. So there's this thing I've been exploring from Omar Khattab called DSPY or DSPy, I think, where it's about you compile these intermediate steps for some kind of chain. And so how do we discover these chains to do tasks? That's kind of the question, I think, is do you give the LLMs like some kind of action space, like here's the kind of things you can do, and then it searches through it somehow?
Yeah, I think for us it's been kind of easier to discover these chains because we're very much this product is very much driven by what we think our users kind of want. So
Hmm.
we're trying to be very UX led with the design of this product, and I think that's quite important with AI product design these days. So because of that, we're very user led. We're listening to what people that want to use it or people that are using it are
Mm.
saying. So we're kind of trying to look at their workflows and say what are the commonly occurring kind of like modules or like facets of their
Hmm.
workflows, and then those are kind of our chains, saying, oh, whether a summary, what doing a summary or doing like a comparison or doing like a kit, like kind of a splitting out key points, or doing like a topic extraction, or doing an extraction of people, or looking for key figures. These are kind of like what we would probably consider chains. So it's kind of easier for us to reason around them because they are very much connected to like requests, and us just aggregating in requests we get
Mm.
from users. So I think that's kind of that's what makes it easier, I suppose, for us to specify out these micro chains I was talking about, because they're very much related to things we know people want. And then you just kind of have routing. You just figure out how to route those to the right place when you get a question in. Now, and figuring out how to do that more and more intelligently is difficult. But that's kind of the way we think about it.
Mm. I think another thing that makes it so interesting is like one podcast we had was with Yana Wellender, who's building Craftful, and so she's kind of like what you're doing. She's marrying these two skills where she's a product manager and she's like has a really good sense of LLMs and prompting and all this kind of stuff, and so she combines that to come up with the micro chains for product manager tasks like analyzing user feedback, prioritizing a roadmap, like that kind of thinking. And I think it sounds like what you're doing with that, but with CRMs and sales and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it sounds like a really nice marriage of these things. Yeah, and yeah, sorry, I had one other idea that I forgot. Maybe we'll come. So coming back to this, I do also kind of want to talk about. So there used to be this thinking around like to have like a moat with your ML product, you would have to like OpenAI is just gonna if all you have is prompts, they're just gonna destroy you eventually.
Yeah, we've had these conversations.
What's your sentiment? I personally believe no, because yeah, I think there's so much to structure, like where you see the structure. And I don't know, but obviously the end to end deep learning people think otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, this is why we're not building a chat app. It's being done. It's being done really well. It's not where we saw our moat, and it's also we know where our skill sets are, and it was in building products that solve kind of difficult uh, problems for researchers and analysts
Mm,
and extracting key insights. And then a huge part of that is UX, and I think UX's role in AI product development has, I'm not going to say underplayed, but it's not like the part that gets the most media attention or the most
mm,
hype around it. But I think it's like incredibly important. And if there's to be in the world of like OpenAI and all of these great providers of large language models, if their models are their moats, the moats for other companies out there should be things around UX, and then
mm,
effectively just how they combine all of these little tasks together in a very user friendly way. And we when before we even wrote a single line of code for this new product, we really just thought about what's the user experience we wanted to deliver. And that's not even to say we're nowhere near where we want to be, but we're really thinking about it and trying to get there as kind of thoughtfully and fast as possible. But what was a really big thing for us, big kind of aha moment, was we had a realization about what this generate would be kind of from a UX point of view. And I think for any data scientists out there or people who are kind of have worked in data science or analysts, it could make sense from a data point of view. But I was a big consumer of Jupyter notebooks. Once upon a time, I worked
mm,
just as a data scientist. So I've done a lot of work in Jupyter notebooks over the years. And people that work with data, they understand implicitly how much of a change those added to the world of like data analysis and
mhm,
how big a deal that was. And we kind of asked ourselves, we said, why does something like this exist for like kind of language knowledge extraction where the primary data is actually like natural language? And what we kind of thought about is no, it doesn't. So that's actually a big inspiration for our UX is we view ourselves as like an AI notebook for knowledge workers. That's kind of like our house thinking around it. And what does that mean? Well, it means we think of your application your in terms of cells. So things are cells just like the way they are in notebooks, and you can add a question cell or you can add a question table cell, which is like the comparison stuff you've seen. You can even add in text notes, which can be marked down or whatever. But beyond just the UI, those being like visual cells, there's something else that's bigger there, and that's reproducibility. So when we talk about reproducibility, what we mean is, let's say you figured out a really nice way to analyze annual reports. You have this workflow. It's kind of like an
mm,
application almost. You have an AI workflow, a way of asking questions and conducting analysis on a bunch of annual reports. Well, that's great. Annual reports come out annually, and quarterly reports come out quarterly. So this is actually a repeated task, something that you'll want to do on some sort of time frame. And this is where the notebook idea I think really shines, because using that we can kind of use the same structure of your notebook and reapply those questions to either new data or updated data. And this is kind of the reproducibility aspect that we've been thinking about. So, I can share my notebook schema with you, and then you can copy that onto your own type of data, as long as hoping that
Hmm.
it's from the same sort of distribution. Um, we're not there just yet, but we have kind of the scaffolding in place to build out this notebook structure. We have like the notebook visuals, and we're getting towards, in the kind of medium term, towards having this shareability and reproducibility in there. And I think that's a game changer, because it not only allows people to do things like common analysis over an annual reports, but it could allow people to create weekly digests from an AI, from
Hmm.
based off of whether it's reports coming in for an executive from people that are reporting into them. Or one other integration we added in at the very start was GitHub. What if I'm a CTO and I want to know what my team has been working on every 3 days? Well, I could have this report that scans my GitHub account, runs it through this report, and delivers it to your email. It's that kind of reproducibility that we've been thinking about, and building these kind of like AI notebooks or AI applications for kind of a really large variety of end users. And when we think about tying this all back to where we started, that isn't really an LLM problem. That's a UX kind of design problem as well. And there's a lot of other kind of engineering problems that you need to solve in order to be able to deliver that. So I think that's where we think our moat is, and that's what kind of
Hmm.
differentiates us.
Yeah. Firstly, that was fantastic. That was mind blowing. I know I'm gonna make them know I'm cutting that out and putting just the last 5 minutes on Twitter. That was, and I'm not even just saying this because we're friends. When I saw the tactic generate, I had this similar kind of thought that like you have tamed the prompt into a UI, so to say. This is like a document comparison thing that makes sense. And yeah, I think like in addition to ChatGPT, I think probably a lot of our listeners know what Perplexity AI is. And Perplexity AI, they have like this kind of like cite your sources GUI with the ChatGPT. So, it's a little more like search engine LLM fused together. And, we've built an open source Verba, which shows you, like, yeah, the front end and the UX is so much opportunity. And I mean, just the last thing you said really is really exciting to me because like I think about like with me, say I have this hypothesis about, like, currently my hypothesis is like, oh, I think gorilla LLMs are going to do such and such a thing. And so I might imagine, like, I one thing that I do, like, one of my, I got this from Tim Scarf. He said this on the Machine Learning Street Talk, is like, what's your information diet? And so part of my information diet is I comb through the tweets I've liked for the last week, and I just kind of see what happened basically. And so I can imagine, yeah, dragging and dropping all of that into tactic, and then saying, like, a question of like, would any of this change my hypothesis about the current thing? Because, like, when Falcon 180B, arbitrary thing that came out this week, is
Yeah,
like, maybe that changes my hypothesis about fine tuning LLMs or
yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
yeah. What you kind of said there is exactly how we're thinking, which is we know there are people out there that have kind of like their own personal workflows for how they like, and a lot of it could be in your head,
Mhm.
how you process data and then the questions you ask of that. And what we're trying to do is just figure out a way to like weave all of that in together and give you just an application to do that. So we're like a intelligent data pipe for
Mm.
workflows. Um, yeah,
So I have a question for you. And this is something I've been thinking about, like, with the Verber project, is like, does fine tuning have any role? Like, so Verba, as a quick background, is like, it's like our retrieval augmented generation app, and we're dog fooding our own Weaviate. You have to use
oh, it's really cool.
Weaviate for the Weaviate documentation. That's how you do it. And so I think about, like, whether you would thumbs up, thumbs down the responses, and then RLHF, and whether that still has a role in these kind of things, or if we're just kind of like zero shot LLMs, go for it.
Yeah, like I think the thumbs up and thumbs down definitely has is important, but like when I think about this, the problem with it, right, is even though like reinforcement learning with human feedback has gotten we know how good it is. You
Mm,
still kind of need like a critical mass of data to get going. Uh,
mm,
and I think it's hard to say to people, well, you need to get like 10,000 responses, like thumbs up and thumbs down to this before you get going. I think anyone that's developed an application where you're looking for like thumbs up and thumbs down responses, no, it's generally it's hard to get clicks and stuff like that, even if you've got a really busy product. A lot of people just don't leave that kind of feedback. But when it comes to fine tuning in general, and then versus something like RAG, the way I've been thinking about it, I saw a really great tweet that stuck in my head ever since I've seen it, and I think it was saying that fine tuning is for style and
mm,
retrieval, and RAG is for facts, and I think that's like that makes total sense to me, and I even seen the work you guys did last week with Gorilla, that I think that like still adheres to all of that, because the style there is actually like a structural style of
mm,
emulating GraphQL, so style is important in that instance. But if facts and retrieval and just bringing back the right data is important, I think retrieval suits more to that need. You're going to get a lot more out of retrieval than fine
mm,
tuning, because most people's data isn't too far out of distribution. Like your data has to be fairly significantly out of the original data distribution, I think, in order for fine tuning to make a ton of sense. And I know there's a lot of people that do fine tune these models on very particular data, and it is, of course, it has its place. But I think for a lot of enterprise users and stuff like that, the value add from uh, from fine tuning mightn't be exactly what they think it will be, especially if it's like trying to imbue facts.
mm.
Like if there's like facts and and figures you want to be returned, I would just use RAG, right? That's it. Just seems so much cheaper, so much faster to iterate on and to control than fine tuning.
Yeah, I think I have a few things on this. Like, so our last podcast with Farshad Farbakshian, a Gen AI specialist at AWS, he presented instead of style, he phrased that as skill versus knowledge, and he used the lawyer example where it's like, me, I could have the world's greatest, like I could have the perfect laws that I need to help get you out of jail, and you're still going to jail if it's me who then has to reason about the laws and help you out. So it's like, but I do agree that like, I think I think as we think about like the future of this too, I think probably there's going to be some like, let's say GPT-5, like what do we think that's going to look like? We're seeing these long context LLMs. Like we had Ophir Press on the podcast to explain how alibi attention works, and like there's even like a week later, there's like yarn scaling, like moves that fast, and so it's like, I think that you'll be able to put so much context into it that it'll really be that will really take over and just zero shot with great context. But so I kind of but so staying, and yeah, the style for so I guess if making one more point on the gorilla thing with that thing is like, I think there are some, for me, gorilla is about like you don't need a massive language model to write GraphQL. Yeah, it's like, and there's a lot of little tasks like that. That's kind of how I see the gorilla thing.
Yeah, and it's probably because GraphQL. The great thing about it is it's a structured language. So I imagine
Mhm.
when finding tuning Llama on that, it probably really picks up on the structure of it fairly fast, because it's a programming language. So it's actually nice and
Mm.
and has a limited syntax, which is good.
Yeah, I'm so excited about like Decicoder. There's like a new code foundation model it's oh man, it's so interesting how you fine tune, but you need like the foundation model checkpoint to fine tune from, and it's like, well, can someone give me a smaller foundation model to then yeah, and it's all really crazy. I mean, yeah, and like I also think the text to SQL models will probably be smaller models, like this, yeah. But so I kind of want to talk a little more about fine tuning, and so I think we both agree that to have your LLM, reason across your documents, provide these summaries, and like aggregate the results from the single questions in the tactic sense, that you probably don't need to fine tune it to reason about your specific thing. It probably is going to just be such a capable reasoning engine that with some retrieved context and with the current thing, it will get you there. But there's still this idea of fine tuning the search models, maybe.
Yeah.
Like maybe fine tune ranking models or embedding models. How do you currently think about that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I see what's great about search models and embedding models and re-rankers is they are like, you know, orders of magnitude easier to fine tune, and
Mm,
they're like lighter, cheaper models in general. And they're just so much smaller. And I actually think retrieval models are such a fantastic example of how bigger isn't always better for
mm,
in terms of in large language models. Retrieval models are just so much better than like very very large language models for picking out the top K candidates. And I know LLMs can't really even do search, but just in
mm,
terms of what if you look at the top retrieval models, kind of in benchmarks out there at the moment, OpenAI's Ada 2 is like kind of in the middle of the results, and you have these open source models that are like probably under 2 gigabytes in size, like vastly outperforming them. Like, I mean, I think that's a really good sign showing that if you've got like specific, very task specific things, that's where
mm.
there still exist cases where LLMs are not the king. It might, sure,
Mhm.
give it a year and I'll probably, change my view on that. But right now, that's still the truth. So when it comes to retrieval models, they're great. They're really easy to fine tune. So let's say we decide, oh, we've got a really good use case for law or for healthcare. Well, then for tactic to train tactic for health or tactic for law, that's a lot easier for us to do, and then to pass that into uh, LLM to kind of pick out the
Mm,
passing in the information it needs. So picking up, improving the retrieval is a much easier task. And for the right, if the other domain is significantly out of domain, you can always
mm,
fine tune Llama or something like that on that domain. There's always an option to do that, and there's probably like a strange correlation between the industries that would require you to self-host a model anyway and how out of
mm,
distribution their data is. I'm talking about like healthcare and like
mhm,
legal stuff. A lot of the time, these might be industries where sharing, the data is so sensitive, it can't be sent over an LLM. So you might as well just fine tune your model on it anyway because it's going to be self-hosted. Or I think
mhm,
that's where I think
mhm,
the future is going to be anyway. When I'm seeing what's happened with Llama the last couple of months, is it's going to be you're going to see a lot of people looking for expertise or companies out there that can help them fine tune and deploy their own
mhm,
special models in house, because there's a bunch of industries out there, and they're just never going to allow certain data to move over the net over their APIs, no matter how secure um, the API provider is or the service provider is. They can't. I live in Europe. There's just no way that some can allow some of that data move over move over the web that easy.
Yeah, well, I want to parse out this, easy to train retrieval models. And I think firstly, I'm talking to the wrong guy because I remember in our other podcast, you used the PyTorch big graph thing, and I mean that is like pretty hard. But I think for me, this is actually kind of the phase shift in training embedding models. I mean, the first thing that happened with LLMs is it was looking like you could use the LLMs to generate synthetic queries, and
Mhm.
that was like now we can use, now we have positive pairs, and that was kind of exciting. But and especially for the long tail queries, like queries that are documents that are frequently queried on, you can kind of even out the distribution more this way by having queries for those documents. But I think even that for me, contrastive learning, I don't think that was going to. I don't know. We see products for fine tuning in the market, but I think this end to end, you train the LLM, the gradients from the LLM go back to the encoder as well.
Yeah,
That makes training embeddings so easy.
yeah,
So,
yeah. I think that's really interesting. Um, the whole world of fine tuning to me, I think, is in flux. Um,
mhm.
I don't know if you saw this week, but there's a new continuation of reinforcement learning for human feedback called,
Mm,
the acronym's so difficult to remember, but reinforcement learning for AI feedback. So
mhm,
it's the exact same as human feedback, but just replacing the human in the loop with a kind of an AI agent that's prompted to understand that task somewhat. And to me, maybe it's my kind of unpopular opinion on RLHF is that I don't think it. I think it's actually it it's going to be something that shouldn't exist in 5 years because it actually highlights issues with our current training regiments for fine tuning and for training models. In that the latent data that the original model is learning from isn't good enough, or the architecture of the model isn't good enough to train a model, to be able to do these chat tasks in a really good way. So you actually need to do this fine tuning step. Whereas my expectation would be that we get enough compute and enough, we improve the architecture enough that in a couple of years we're kind of just back to where we were with the original autoregressive models, which is you're just passing in the data, and you're not giving it any. You don't even necessarily need to do this reinforcement learning task. It's just it it has enough capacity to learn. I'm in a chat context here, or here I'm in an instruction context, or here I'm in an extraction
Mm,
context. That to me seems more pure than this layer at the end of doing fine tuning.
mhm.
But not that I think reinforcement learning hasn't been amazing. It's been what's given us kind of the last year's worth of improvements. But it feels like an in between step.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't really have a great thought on this. I guess for me it's like the difference is always I guess I don't really understand the difference that well, honestly. Like with reinforcement learning with human feedback, it's like you like the answer, so you could also just kind of language model that answer. It's not necessarily that it has to be +1, -1, optimized with proximal policy optimization, and have a reward model and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure I understand. I know that there is, like, if people out there listening are curious, like Nathan Lambert has written a lot of great stuff about this at Hugging Face, and I haven't read it yet, so I don't know. But this this kind of like LLMs versus synthetic data is so interesting. I mean, kind of coming back to tactic. I mean, I could imagine like and maybe not the current generation of LLMs, but the multimodal LLMs that like use a UI, or well, I mean, yeah, maybe coming out of the UI and just, let's say, just with APIs, right? Like we could have LLMs, like a multi-agent kind of system. This kind of, yeah. What do you think about this kind of direction of like? I think there is a paper. It's like large language models, content and behavior language models, something like this. But yeah, it's like about the LLMs, like they simulate using, because you mentioned like GPT-4 eval, where the LLM is prompted like with the instruction response pair, did the response follow the instruction? And people are that's actually, like, I think the most common way people evaluate question answering systems. Yeah.
Yeah, so like I do think we're probably going to see a world where it's just going to be like it's going to be models calling models. I mean, what you guys have done with Gorilla, I think you could, if you think about it, you could probably just extend
Mhm.
that outwards, right? Which is um, your model Gorilla is for kind of has knowledge of certain GraphQL schemas. Well, I have my private model, which I also have trained on my private GraphQL schema, or maybe it's the rest,
Mhm.
maybe it's SQL. Those models can now talk to each other in like natural language. They actually don't need to know each other's schemas.
Mhm.
So my one can request data from yours via like natural language queries and vice versa, and then they can convert those in the background to the accurate schemas, return it. So I think there's this. I've vaguely thought about this, where you have this world now where you can have models effectively talking to each other that are fine tuned on very specific schemas, but they have no knowledge that the other one has like a specific schema behind it, because the
Mhm.
response model would probably still come back, in a natural language response, but like it's actually querying a structured database, whether it's SQL or GraphQL or whatever it is. So yeah, that's kind of what I saw you did last week. I was like, oh yeah, you could potentially have this world of just like agents talking to each other, very just through natural language, but just distilling it down.
Yeah, no, I'm really gonna like dream into the future with this one, but I've also been thinking a lot about CRMs, and particularly like like my dream with the Gorilla project is kind of the integrations angle, where you would say build a Llama index query engine from my Notion workspace titled biochemistry, store the data in Weaviate, embed the data with Cohere, re-rank it with Cohere, or like visualize it with a Rise. Like, I want to see this like combination of all these things together. And so I think like, with like a CRM, this has kind of been, when Bob was first like pitching, like, explaining his vision for generative feedback loops, this kind of idea of like, personalization has always been like that. I love that. Like, when we developed the blog post, it was like Airbnb listings, and it's like write an advertisement for Connor who travels with his dog Bowen, or Bob who's a power lifter and needs like a special kind of gym. And so it's like, this kind of thing of like, why would Deepset be interested in my gorilla blog posts? Like, help me, the LLM come up with something for me, right? And so that's where I see like CRMs and, like thinking about the other agents in your system with the the future of like API design. And yeah.
And I think the tricky part there, right, is the routing systems, because now
Mm.
we need these routers, and it's like it's kind of funny that these concepts are returning that people haven't really had to think about for years. Like since the initiation of the web. So now you have this. Now you have routers in the sense of for large language models, and
Mhm.
sending things to. I suppose in a way you could kind of call them the right experts or whatever.
Mm.
And but you kind of still need this routing system on top. And I think that's a problem I'm working on like today, trying to figure out when is the right time to use a router, how like why should you use one, and then if they're talking to with these experts like the ones you're using, how do you represent what that expert knows,
Mm.
which expert can do what, is it just like a is it a descriptor, or can this router actually go out there and talk to these experts and say which of you is the can provide the best candidate answer to my question?
Yeah, I had Shashiran Tianjun from Berkeley, the authors of Gorilla. I asked them the same exact question. Like, are we going to need to have a hierarchy of gorillas? Like, like, yeah, I feel like just, I guess it's like, well, for what we've done so far with the GraphQL APIs, I can fit all of that into, it's 46 APIs, but it's like, there are atomic APIs, and then Weaviate allows some compositionality, like how you combine like, vector search with aware filter, limit the results, see the object vector. So, like you could fit all the atomic APIs in the prompt with some explanation of how the compositionality works. And if you give that to GPT-4, obviously use the strongest thing you can to see if it works at all. And then like,
And then
and
you're
then that, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then that could give you like the natural language command to then hand to the, smaller, more economical Weaviate gorilla. So yeah, that's how I kind of see that thing. And I guess if I can ask one more question on the CRMs thing, because I really like exploring this idea, is like, I feel like with business, kind of like the most effective thing you can do is kind of like try to make a lot of people more success, right? Like, and it kind of like, I feel like tree of thoughts, this kind of like planning could have such an interesting intersection with these CRM kind of things where it's like, like I have these different projects that I could pursue, right? And it's like if for each of these ideas, these like CRM reasoners could like, go in and say, okay, well, DeepSet probably wouldn't get too much out of that. Streamlit might get something out of that, and then like put it all together, and then say, hey, Connor, I've done the analysis. I think you should do this project.
Yeah, I mean that's a we've kind of had a very equivalent thought around CRMs, but specifically with some of the users we have in our existing core product, which is kind of sales and marketing people, which is they feed us a list of accounts from their CRM, and we help them pick which ones are
Mm.
the best ones for them to target, to do their job the best and to have the highest efficiency and success rate. So if you think about a reasoning agent there, what Tactic does is we pull back in our core applications, we pull back information and data, we extract data about all of these companies. So reasonably, you could hypothesize that using a CRM and then, using, if you specify out like a kind of a prompt or some kind of reasoning around what ideal customers look like, you should be able to allow this thing. You could feasibly have like a kind of a chain of thought going on, looking at these accounts, the knowledge you have about them, and reasoning, giving like a, you're a salesperson, you're an account exec, you're going to be calling people tomorrow. Imagine you come back in tomorrow morning 9 o'clock, and you check your CRM, and you have like a list of today's target accounts, and then you have reasonings why, and you have like some explanations in your CRM being like, I think you should talk to this person at this company because this change has just occurred. They've just hired this person, or this change has happened in the market. That'll be really cool. And I don't think stuff like that is, too far off, to be honest. We've explored parts of that. So
Yeah, I guess maybe the biggest part with that is maybe it's, I mean, the whole connecting data to Weaviate, that's exploding. Like, we just did a podcast with David Garnitz from Vector Flow. There's Unstructured we did a podcast with, and there are a few that we're talking about. But this, like, how do you, like, how do I keep Charles's last week updated in my CRM, right? Like, yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it's such a cool topic. I love thinking about kind of the future of CRMs because I do feel like that would be the big thing is like if we could just better organize business, better organize our efforts, better coordinate everyone, sort of, right? Like it's kind of, I mean, yeah, like I love thinking about the multi-agent perspective of LLMs, of like not necessarily like, yes, LLMs, but like, the way that things work, sort of like it needs to, you need, at the end of the day, your thing you're building needs to like appeal to a person. Otherwise,
yes,
yeah.
100%. And like I think you can kind of tie that back to what we were talking about at the start, with even with Tactic Generate in terms of workflows. People, like leaving the land of just talking in terms of agents. What LLMs are trying to do is, or the value I think that people see in them and investors see in them, is that everyone has, all these workers out there have these workflows, and
Mm.
there's repetition within these workflows, and there's tasks that need to be done, and these workflows can also be defined somewhat. So using these models, the idea is make workers more efficient by automating the parts of these workflows that can be automated, and there are parts in there. And by actually doing that, when we automate away um, these parts, you make workers more productive by allowing them to focus on a lot more of the deeper thought work,
Mm.
or the more complex parts of their job. And I think that's where we see the power in LLMs, is that we know that there's people out there that have processes that they work through, and it's like, okay, how do we like best capture those, and like just solve the parts of that aren't enjoyable, or that are just real time suckers, the things that really take up your time. And I think everyone in most industries could, like, if they think about it, can be like, what do I still do every week that's manual? And there's always
Mm.
something out there that's like a manual research thing that people do. And of course anyone can build their own, if you have the knowledge, you can build your own, really intelligent kind of automation around that. So what we're trying to do is
Mm.
build those for people, and a lot of that will actually end up as well being integrations on inwards and outwards integrations. Like, we take in data from GitHub, from Salesforce, and we export it to wherever. So that kind of flow as well will be really important, integrating with a lot of common workflows for people.
Yeah, that's amazing. I just imagine how much everyone will be supercharged by that because it's like not only do you have your own assistant that kind of manages like you have 6 emails today, you have this meeting, like how you might think about like a 1970s secretary. Now it like could even organize, it could even like schedule your, like, I have you back to back with Charles and say I have someone else working on a similar project because like it wouldn't be too much of a context switch for you to then talk to someone else similar to Charles. And or like you wake up and it's like you have this meeting and here's why. Like,
Like,
yeah.
and it can be something as simple as, you've been away. I was away on holidays last week, so I come back, and I just want to know what's been going on in my Slack. I just want to know. And I know
Mm.
there's tools out there that they already do that, but that's one integration. So how do you build a tool that can kind of build those integrations for everything and repeat that? And this is where, and the questions, uh, a tech person or an engineering person might ask of Slack might be very different to what someone in go-to-market function would want to ask. And again, extrapolate that to GitHub, what a CTO might want to know about, how their team has been getting on and what bugs have been occurring. And imagine you could ask, okay, what bugs have been occurring, and like what parts of the code are these occurring in, and like so then
Mm.
that might help you realize, oh, we need some better testing on like this part of our database, or sorry, this part of our code repo, because bugs are like consistently occurring there, and you could always discover that via your own analysis. But these are things you can actually automate away as well, we think.
Yeah, that is the killer. That's really exciting. I mean, just yeah, like testifying from with Weaviate and trying to keep up with everything that happens in the Slack, and then yeah, and then also trying to tie that to the code base, which is itself like an entire like city of complexity.
Yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I understand the pain. I think anyone that's worked on any kind of project that's grown in complexity knows. And, I recently looked at the Weaviate code base and I'd worked on it a tiny bit, maybe 2 years ago, small contributions. I was like, oh wow, it's completely different. I had thousands of commits to pull down when I changed my brand. So
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, that would probably be one of the biggest applications of that generative feedback loop thing. I think is summarizing the Slack. So, one more question I wanted to end with from our talk. A year and a half ago, we were talking about we talked pretty heavily about graph embeddings and knowledge graphs, and I want to hear like where's your sentiment on that now?
I'm still long on graph embeddings. I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, in that there's expensive ways to do things, and LLMs are an expensive hammer.
Mm,
Brilliant, and that's great. But I think in order to really connect data that's not just language, and that are kind of topics and objects, and uh, I think that's where graph embeddings are still going to, or graph models are going to take off, or like that they will be relevant. What I saw in the last week, which was kind of cool, is a lot more people working on generating graphs from LLMs. And we
mm,
spoke really briefly about this, I think maybe 2 years ago, or
mm,
kind of had discussed that. But we're probably now in a place where that is way more feasible, in that you say to a model, here's an article, just write me here's the set of relationships that we can have
mm,
between objects, and here's the set of objects types that can exist, or node types that can exist. Just send me in whatever graph format, because there's like a million graph formats out there, but just send me whatever I want in, like, head, relation, tail format, all of the relations you see in this text, and then you can slowly build up like a graph database then of all of these
mm,
relations, and then you could further train this to model the latent space of these, and that would be a much cheaper way, in my opinion, than to build like a, a knowledge graph understanding of what's going on in your data, without having to LLM absolutely everything and build up a
mm,
huge open AI bill. So I do probably, I would say, graph embeddings has probably fallen out of the limelight a little bit within the last year or two, just because of how easy um, LLMs have made it to do a lot of the tasks people were looking to those for. But I do think
mm,
that there's a lot of value in them, and I've still used them for little projects over the last year or so, and I
mm.
just think it's quite amazing actually when you see them train, how like the latent spaces of graphs is just so cool to me still. So yeah, I still have quite a bit of belief in them still.
Yeah, well, I guess for me the like the connection of graphs and then causal inference has always been what keeps me interested in this topic more than anything else, because like earlier I mentioned that I get my new week of Twitter, and basically the question I'm asking in my own head is, does any of this news change my world model of how things work, and then thus how I'm planning to spend my time because of my belief in how things are. And so I do think like if you extracted, and it's like the comparison across documents thing, if you extract the structure of the relation relation entities, and then compared them with each other, it might be a more efficient way of saying this document disagrees with this other document, compared to just looping through it with the LLM and being like, does this paragraph agree with this one?
Actually, a really good point, because there is a well-known a well-known problem class in graphs is not just node classification, but also like graph classification and graph
Mm.
comparison. So if you're building up subgraphs of things, reasonably compare a generated graph versus a generated graph, and have a similarity score off of that, which is again cheaper than LLMing that straight out of the box.
Yeah, well, I think there's so much that, I mean, I guess it's like I guess one thing that I'm really interested in is like if something happens that changes everything in your document before
Mm.
then what do you do about that kind of? And yeah, no, the whole thing is pretty interesting. I mean, yeah, graph embeddings. I guess here would be my question about graph embeddings that I've struggled with is I really like this idea of like I have all my documents and I connect them with symbolic structure and maybe I propagate that to have better embedding somehow. But then how do I put my query into the graph as well?
So how do you query the graph? Yeah, so I actually have done stuff on this in the past, and there's like I think there's like a couple of ways in, which is like you could, if you're like embedding a graph into, let's say I'm creating like I have a Weaviate instance, and the vector embedding is like an actual graph. Well, then what I could have is like the query could link to some textual representation I have of like an object in that graph, and then from there I could resolve that down to like an item within the graph. So
Mm.
let's say I search, I want to discover films about Ben Affleck. Well, then the query might be Ben Affleck. I have a text object that I know resolve that down to the, maybe it doesn't have to be one, but resolve that down to like a couple of nodes. So one of them might be Ben Affleck, one might be the Batman films, and from there then you can try and return relevant results
Mm.
from that graph back. But resolving natural language to that's one idea maybe I have for how you could resolve natural language back down to graph embeddings. But I know it is a tricky thing, because it doesn't naturally translate, right? They're
Mhm.
very abstract concepts like an item or a node embedding.
Yeah, I heard that same idea from Professor Laura Dietz from the University of New Hampshire was on the podcast, and yeah, she explained that same kind of idea of you could like retrieve with the embeddings and then re-rank with the graph or vice versa, and yeah, it does sound like a pretty cool way of doing it. Yeah, awesome. Charles, it's been such an interesting podcast. Let me ask you one more big question, which is actually, sorry, before this quickly I'm very curious because you're building an actual product with LLMs, and I'm very curious where your sentiment is on the Llama CPP GGML, this kind of like would you replace GPT-4 with Llama 2 with those kind of inference libraries? What would it take for the tipping point to hit?
um, I think it's probably more a matter of like when if when we're going to do this. And I think it also is kind of use case dependent. But a big aspiration of ours that we're going to do is we're going to have an enterprise offering of this where we'll host this model for you. We'll get that set up.
Mm.
And this, I spoke about it briefly, but in that world, it's not going to be GPT-4. It's not going to be whatever. It's going to be, those models are going to have to be on someone else's, on someone that we're hosting this is for, is cloud.
Hmm.
On their AWS instance. It's going to have to be their model. Their data can't leave their AWS VPN, or like VPC, I should say. So it's going to have to stay within there. And in that world, when we get to those, because we want to help those kind of enterprise customers out that have this kind of, they want to use what Tactic Generate can do, but the data can't leave. And when we get to solving those problems, that's where we know we're going to have to use these types of models. And we're very well aware of that, and we're working on it, and we're looking at Llama, and we're saying we're kind of
Hmm.
we have our plan of action for when we need to execute that. We're ready to go and kind of deploying those at that version of that of Tactic Generate to do that when we need it.
Yeah, that's super interesting to hear. Yeah, I think like what Amazon is doing with that is really interesting. We had a podcast with Rohit Agarwal from Portkey, and I think kind of this like load balancing between the LLM APIs, managing, updating it, and taking one down. I think there's another software layer in between there. And yeah, that sounds super interesting. So yeah, let me ask you kind of the big kind of concluding podcast question, which is like, what is sort of the thing that is on the frontier that excites you the most?
Wow, that is a big question. Um, what's on the frontier that excites me the most? Okay, I would say um, I'm I'm a big I'm a bit I read a lot. I like a lot of creative things, so
Hmm.
I'm really excited to see how creative models can really become
Mm.
a point where, not that it's like a novelly interesting. I want to see some I want to see stuff generated by models that's like, affects you like the way a good book or a good film would affect you.
Mm.
And I think, people might laugh at that now, or they might find it kind of funny, but the very first 4 years ago, or whenever GPT-2 came out, I fine-tuned a model on scripts, film scripts, and
Mm.
was able to generate film scripts, and I thought that was amazing. And now GPT 3.5 can do that with barely any specific fine-tuning on that. So the fact that that's like the change that occurs in like 3 4 years, I think, probably in very less than 3 years, 3 years being a highly conservative estimate, you're probably going to see some really cool art being created by these models. I don't know what the modality will be, but something like
Mm.
that will happen. So that's like kind of a fun, one of the fun, cool things that I'm waiting to see happen, where people are very happy to consume media that's generated by these things. Not maybe not all of it, but that's something I'm looking forward to, and I think it's going to happen. So
Yeah, I agree completely. It sounds so exciting. I mean, I've always liked thinking about like, I always thought about this as like compositional generalization. Like the avocado shaped armchair is like the concept of avocado composed with armchair. And yeah, I think, I guess there's like that trying to think too hard about like what it means to be new art, right? And then there's like, I like this other kind of, people who are skeptical of AI art and stuff, where they say, there's quite a lot to the human connection to it. Like, I like this Travis Scott song, not just because it sounds good, but it's also like he's putting his brand, his reputation behind it. And there's something like, kind of like this podcast, right? Like you and I are both like, humans behind the content, sort of. So,
yeah.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I like where I kind of fall on that is like I 100% agree. I like to read, especially if it's, you can feel something personal in there or whatever
Mhm.
it is. But the compositional aspect, I still will think will probably still exist in there, where
Mm.
you know if you probably showed songwriters the equipment that's available nowadays for people to create music, they would maybe say something similar, which is like, that's not creating music because they're not using real instruments, or it's not, that's not a real piano, that's not a real keyboard, it's not a real drum, it's generated, or it comes from a key, like a computer. So people are going to still have to like prompt these stories in a certain way, or there will be some sort of thing in there that like will be some compositional element. And
Mm.
I think humans will you're going to have people that are better composers of these tools than others, and maybe that's where we'll see people kind of have their fingerprint, putting their stamp on their own art with this. But yeah, who knows?
Yeah, that's awesome, Charles. And Charles, thank you so much for coming back on the Weaviate podcast. It's such a fun chat. I learned so much, and I hope everyone listening checks out Tactic Generate. It is, I think we already kind of talked about it thoroughly, but like, I'd say it's like the same way Perplexity is, bringing together search and LLMs. You're bringing together kind of like multiple personal documents and this interface. It's super cool. So I hope everyone checks it out. And Charles, thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. It means a lot. Cheers. Thank you.